Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the PetroNerds podcast. My name is Trisha Curtis. I'm the CEO of PetroNerds and the host of the PetroNerds podcast. I am delighted to be with you here today. We're going to do an introduction to this podcast, episode 123 of the PetroNerds podcast. It is a January 9th, 2025. We're off to a new year. This is the first podcast of the new year. So happy new year to everyone. And we have a lot of ground to cover in this introduction, which is going to be, we're actually going to do a little bit of a throwback because this podcast is the presentation and talk that I gave at Colorado School of Mines in October. And I went through this and I was a little hesitant about dropping this because I thought it might not be relevant, but I went through and I think it's really it's a really tight, short conversation and then followed by a lot of Q&A, which I think is really fascinating. So the topic of this presentation is geopolitical economics in a nutshell, geopolitical economy, the economics, all in a nutshell. And I'm really walking through students, largely petroleum engineering students, but others were invited as well at Colorado School of Mines, really walking them through the sort of the state of energy and geopolitics and what's going on. And what you hear in the Q&A is very, very enlightening. And we end up talking a lot about CO2 emissions. Partly that's because I started out the podcast I started out the conversation that way because I had just gotten back from Europe. And funnily enough, this might be a podcast you can listen to on a slightly faster speed because I'm a little jet lagged and I was just coming back from Europe and had some insights from there. So I'll come back to this in a second and talking a little bit more about the weeds. But right now it is January 9th, 2025. So it's Thursday. And we have the market actually closed right now because it is Jimmy Carter's funeral. And we'll note that for just a moment because there's some harkening back to history that we should think about. But we are seeing a noticeable move higher. So we've got fires ripping in Los Angeles. We have Jimmy Carter's funeral taking place today on January 9th. And we have oil prices really moving higher. I mean, last year we were seeing 69 and even $67 barrel. And now we're seeing 74.28. It's moved up a buck overnight. For WTI, we're seeing Brent at 77.23. We're seeing Henry Hub at $3.70. So really materially move higher. If you've looked at the EIA, you will see that there today in energy yesterday had a big thing on EIA showing $2 basically flat for the course of 2024 for on average is that we had historically low natural gas prices last year. I put in a LinkedIn post and I really want to underscore and emphasize this, folks. We had at one point last year, we had $23 an MCF for natural gas residential prices charged to the consumer when we have average $2 an MCF natural gas. That is highway robbery and something that utility companies need to be held accountable for. So Dutch TTF, we're seeing 1378, and we are seeing we are going to talk about the 10-year yield in the Fed because there's a lot going on right there. Given the Fed minutes came out yesterday, so Dutch TTF 1378 10-year yield is 4.689%. This is causing a lot of consternation in the market. So I think that we're not appreciating and talking about higher oil prices. They need to be, a lot of folks have sort of, if you've listened to oil analysts, if you're staying up late and watching the stock market, particularly 10 p.m. or 11 p.m. at night, you will see that when oil analysts are talking, they're really saying we don't expect these higher prices to last very long. We actually see more like 60s. So it's interesting that we're not getting a little more talk about current oil prices and what's driving that. But the 10-year yield, you're hearing a ton about that because that 4.689% is pushing the 30-year mortgage well back above 7%. So it's more something close to 7.1% I saw the other day on the stock market. And we were already seeing material pullback in mortgages and mortgage originations and in home sales in December. And folks said, oh, this might be seasonal, but actually year over year, there's a material decline. So what we've had is the Fed lowering interest rates and actually mortgage rates going up or interest rates going up on mortgages. And so the market is basically discounting everything the Fed is doing and pushing back on it. And I want to get into that, but I want to start by talking about oil prices first because I put a note on LinkedIn yesterday, and apparently my German Shepherd is the one that's getting all the attention because I just put a picture of him and a Happy New Year and a kind of rip on the market. Oil prices materially higher, I think, is definitely something that has to be watched. So in addition to this 10-year yield ripping and a lot of throwing consternation and volatility in the market, we're seeing right now in the first 9 days of 2025 is volatility, and I think we should expect volatility for 2025. I think we need to talk about Trump and things that Trump might do, but we also need to wait till Trump actually gets into office, especially when it comes to energy and geopolitics, because they're very interrelated, as well as the economy. But Trump is not going to like $75 oil. So I think if we keep pushing prices up higher, if they stay there, that's going to be problematic. But a CNBC article, if you were just to go into CNBC and you're checking oil prices, CNBC article, I think, puts it really well. I don't, this is not, to me, this is not about Chinese demand. This is not about US demand. This is about a cold snap in winter. And I think it really tells you that we are using heating oil, and which is typically heating oil is diesel. So when you're using diesel or any refined product, that does push up oil prices. So we're seeing a demand and a snap in a cold snap, and that's driving both natural gas prices up, but it's also driving diesel prices or oil prices up because you use heating oil to actually heat homes on the East Coast, and we're definitely seeing colder weather. We're certainly seeing. I have my utility bill. I've talked about this a lot, but it's over. It was $208 last month, and I wasn't here for the better part of December, so that's a little frustrating and annoying because I just left my thermostat, I think, at 64. But we've seen Excel put another rate hike us on natural gas. Interesting. There's some Denver articles. I think the Denver Post has actually criticized them and saying they say they're investing in natural gas, and Denver Post thinks that they should be investing less in natural gas and more in renewables. I would argue, along with other articles that are saying that the Excel is saying that this is a cost increase for natural gas to pay for natural gas infrastructure. But if they're not actually investing in more natural gas infrastructure, which is what they tell you on the earnings calls, then maybe you're getting a natural gas price increase to help them pay for all the other infrastructure costs, particularly related to renewables. And so I know that's controversial, but it's really important to point out. We're definitely seeing a price spike in oil prices, and one of that is partly because people are using oil not just for driving, but also for heating their homes. And I think that is something that we need to particularly pay attention to, and probably that's been exacerbated actually in the last few years as we have less natural gas in the system, is particularly in Europe, and less flexibility in the natural gas system. But we are seeing that pressure up on nat gas as well. So oil price being up, Brent at 77.25. Now, I think if we get too much higher than this, if we look at Brent at 80, or we start seeing WTI at 75 or even higher, that's problematic. It's not just problematic for the US economy, it's problematic for the global economy. And I don't think that's something Trump wants to see, or is positive for the global economy. So I think that would definitely hurt demand. And that's something I noted in my LinkedIn post, but definitely something to pay attention to. Now, with regards to Trump policies, I want to touch on that a little bit. There's a lot being said. But I think the biggest things, if you're thinking of going into 2025, what are the biggest themes right now? That is that we do have higher oil prices than people expected right now. I don't think you should expect these 70-ish oil prices, which are not that high, but they're not that low either. And I don't think you should expect them for the duration of 2025. There's certainly many, many factors that can cause these prices to stay here, or keep prices here, or even drive them higher. Absolutely, a number of geopolitical events and wars and all kinds of things that could unfold. But Trump has a lot of levers. And also, we need to put in context of this is that we are producing 13.5 million barrels per day as of October 2024. So that's the latest data out of the EIA. We also see an uptick in natural gas production. So that is really telling you that we do have a cold snap. The fact that we're seeing 370 nat gas, and yet the latest figures, we're definitely increasing natural gas production in October, over 125 billion cubic feet per day, kind of pushing toward back to 126 BCF a day. Now, that is important because a few months prior to that, when we saw the peak earlier in the year, it was 128 billion cubic feet per day. We came off of that. And that was certainly helpful in getting, we definitely have seen well less than 100 rigs of drilling for natural gas. Sub 600 rigs are drilling overall in the U.S., and yet we're producing 13.5 million barrels per day. Mike Wirth was on CNBC. I did not see the entire interview, but I thought he said he was speaking a truth and speaking really clear on oil. And he was saying that the U.S. actually has production has a lot more to give in the U.S. And he said that there's a lot of opportunity on land that we have not even tapped. And that is particularly important in the context of the fact that we are producing 13.5 million barrels a day. There's a lot of work I've done previously on U.S. shale. I cut my teeth on U.S. shale, and I'm very, very bullish on the rock. So I know there's folks in the industry that disagree with me on the growth potential, but if you listen to the latest podcast with Brenton Cheeseman, the VP of North America for NCS Multistage and a good friend and colleague. And you also listen to Lane Weirs, the VP of Field Engineering for Liberty Energy. You'll hear a very interesting and optimistic and positive trend in terms of the opportunity of U.S. shale, but also the role of the service sector. And so it is a phenomenal and fantastic podcast, folks. This is the conversation I had, the panel discussion I had at the Denver Earth Resources Library at the Rockies Expo. And I think if you listen to that and you take into account everything that's going on, you can see that my views are definitely a little different. But I think you also see folks within the industry, particularly if Lane Weirs and Brenton Cheeseman and folks like Mike Worth are saying we have a lot more to go. I really believe, folks, we have a lot more to go. And you actually hear that when you're on the ground in the field as well. So, okay, so oil prices are moving up. Put a pin in that. I don't think that's I definitely do not think that's positive for the global economy and problematic, and could be something that really pushes Europe over the edge, and maybe parts of the US as well. That being said, I would say the easiest way you could probably characterize the oil industry and the sentiment right now, and probably parts of the vast majority of the US economy, is optimism and uncertainty. So there's a lot of optimism with regards to Trump and what those policies are going to look like, right? That we're going to have less regulation, that we're going to keep the lower tax rate, and that we're going to reduce big government, right? And the ability to reduce the size of government is one thing, but just actually stopping the growth is a whole nother. And that's something that Chris Wright talked about in a previous podcast with me. But I think those are really optimistic things. So when you hear people talking on the stock market and you hear analysts talk about the economy, um, a lot of really intelligent ones will say, yes, the stock market and people are nervous and they think that, lots of volatility with Trump and who knows what he's going to do. But on the other side of that, overwhelmingly, Trump is less regulation, is pulling out the red tape, and is pro-business. And so that means there's optimism on that front, and that can help offset some economic decline to a degree. The question is the real fragilities in the U.S. economy. When we're talking about higher mortgage rates, when we're talking about um, the 10-year yield being tracked to the higher mortgage rates, the fact that the Fed is lowering interest rates, but mortgage rates are going up, and you still have the sticky inflation. I mean, looking at egg prices, I paid $12 for an 18 pack. We're definitely pushing toward $1 an egg, which is absolute insanity. And then you see these wildfires, which can cause a lot of inflation when we're talking about not having insurance and having to rebuild, especially in rich parts of America. So there's question marks certainly on the economy and the health of the economy, and then what Donald Trump will do. But I think overwhelming from a business standpoint, less regulation and pro business, that's positive. Now, geopolitically speaking, there are bigger question marks. So I think I want to harken back a little bit to the Fed right now, because yesterday what we saw and what we're hearing within market commentary is this uncertainty surrounding a Trump presidency and what this means. I'm not going to get into all of Trump's comments that he's made. I'm going to wait till Trump actually gets into office, and I'm happy to talk about some of those if people want to. But I'm going to wait till Trump gets in office and we start seeing the policies day one, and actually what happens. But what we're seeing in the stock market and this 10-year yield is people are blaming it on what a Trump presidency is going to look like. And I think that's a little bit unfair. I'll be, I've been on the record saying I did not think what happened to Liz Truss and her losing her job over saying that she was going to lower taxes, and then, crazy LIBOR or crazy interest rates and volatility within bonds within the UK economy. That was a complete mess, and she lost her job over that. A prime minister lost her job. I don't think that's not going to happen to Trump or in the US, but it definitely, that's what people were talking about yesterday, and particularly last night, is that as we're seeing this 10-year yield push up, they're saying that this is a bet, right? That the stock market, or folks are saying this is a bet that Trump policies are going to be inflationary. And I don't necessarily think that's what the market's telling you. I think the market's been telling you it's had a higher 10-year yield for a while, and that's been over the course of the Biden administration. So Janet Yellen was on TV yesterday. I think it was Bloomberg or CNBC. I only saw a clip. I think it was CNBC, and I was particularly frustrated with it because she said, "Hey, basically we won this battle on inflation." Well, she's the Secretary of Treasury. She was the former Fed chair, and apparently she has a very, very close relationship still with Jerome Powell, and so there's a lot of influence by her on the Federal Reserve. I am frustrated with Federal Reserve because I think they remain dovish, and I think they remain with a dovish bias that can really hurt, really hurt in their ability to help inflation in the first place, and continues to be, because if the market is pushing that 10-year yield up and they're lowering interest rates, everything they're doing is kind of null and void. And the only thing it's impacting is people who want to put their money and save it and actually get a return on it. That's what it's impacting. But she came out yesterday and they asked her about inflation. She basically said, "We think we have it under control," and she's confident that it's going to keep going down. And then I think they cut it, but I believe they asked her about fiscal policy and what was happening within Washington and if that contributed to inflation. She said maybe a little bit, but it was really supply side driven. And I think that's not only completely naive, that's not truthful. And I think that's what we're hearing too much in the market right now is that the market has not been honest that. And nor has the Federal Reserve been honest that fiscal policy under the Biden administration and Congress and spending the way they did contributed to inflation. But they didn't have all the craziness and the talk and the rhetoric particularly from the Federal Reserve over the Biden administration, but now they have it. And that's where I think it's unfair to say, uh, Trump has not even gotten to office, but we're going to start talking about that within our Fed minutes, and then we're going to move the market on that. That's extremely frustrating. And particularly, I'm a fan of the Fed not lowering interest rates. They shouldn't have lowered them a half a basis point in September. They shouldn't have lowered them again in December. I'm a fan of them not, or in November, December. I'm a fan of them not lowering interest rates again next year. I think they could hold them here and be just fine. I do not think these rates are nearly as restrictive as they think, and I think the market's pushing this back up. But I don't think the market is entirely pushing this back up just because the Fed came out and said, this is, we're concerned about Trump policies. I think the market's also pushing this back up because there are things within the global economy that are inflationary, right? The Fed didn't do their job. They didn't get inflation under control. You have things like the bird flu, you have geopolitics, you have this press up in oil prices. I mean, there are a lot of factors at play. And you have, when you have the service cost inflation, things that remain secure, like housing and services, you can have these renewed things. And so it's really, really important for people to realize that under the first Trump administration, I'm not saying it's going to be the same, but in the first Trump administration, because we had not had inflation before, no one was talking about inflationary policies under Trump. Okay. So it is interesting now that we didn't have any inflation under Trump. We had lower than 2% inflation and we had a ripping economy. But now we're talking about it because they're concerned that on the back of it, what they're not telling you is that we have existing inflation, right? We have not quelled it. And so there are ways that you can reinflate that. And certainly policies can induce that. But I think we have to be very, very honest that this is a complex, very, very complex conversation. And all of this does impact the economy, right? I think we're seeing in Europe where there are concerns now, well, hey, we're having they're lowering interest rates, but they may not be able to lower interest rates nearly as aggressively as they thought in the UK because they have sticky and persistent inflation. This is not outright stagflation, but it's definitely echoing a little bit of stagflation. And I think it is pertinent to recognize this is the funeral of Jimmy Carter and a recognition of Jimmy Carter. But, things that were talked about today are things that Jimmy Carter's known for, which are not super positive things. I mean, he's known for many, many positive things as US president, but he was a one-term president and he did not get reelected. And I think what we're seeing this globally, right? Where, we have volatility obviously in South Korea with the president being impeached after he enacted martial law, and then he's barricaded himself and has resisted arrest effectively. But we're also seeing Trudeau stand down in Canada, and so he's just one of many, in addition to Joe Biden, who lost his incumbency because of inflation and because of the post-COVID years and policies that helped induce inflation. And I think just that case in point, if the stock market would start diving into that and say, why is Trudeau stepping down? Well, it's because these policies are inflationary. Well, that's policies, right? That's policies of the incumbent. So it isn't quite fair to say that the new policies of the next guy, the reason Trump got elected, a large portion is because of inflation. And so that's something that when you think of Jimmy Carter, that's what happened as well, right? Arab oil embargo, he had to put a lot of stuff on energy. I mean, energy became a really, really present thing under the Jimmy Carter administration, and they had inflation, right? And so they had to put Volcker in, and Volcker had to raise interest rates. So painful for the economy. And so I think what we're hearing is I have not been I don't think the stock market analyst coverage, the Fed has done a good job of one. They're not clear. The Fed is talking about, you know, guiding in a dark room where they can't see anything and they're stumbling and hitting things. If the Fed is admitting that, that means they're doing a really terrible job. But also, they're just not being honest about current policies and future policies. And I think it's really unfair to start ripping on the future administration when they're not in office and impact interest rates in the economy today when they should have said, hey, we're just going to wait and see. And, that's up to obviously folks on the Fed, but then that means, maybe they should diversify the Fed a little bit because they're 93% Democrat. And I don't care if they're Democrat or Republican, but I think there should be much more diversity of thought, and shouldn't be less just prone to the dovish bias, because that can mean that we can, if we have an economy that's weakening a little bit or jobs weakening, which we actually may need to quell inflation and reset the economy, that if we just tank and lower interest rates really quickly, that we could have reignited inflation. And then what we end up with is a stagflation, maybe not to the extent of the 1970s, but definitely something bad. So that is my rant on the Fed and inflation and that. What you're going to hear within this talk and presentation, and I'm gonna square this circle quickly so you can get right into it. This is a short and tight presentation that I gave to the Colorado School of Mines, these students, and I wanted to go through. This is pre-election, so it's an interesting conversation. But this is energy, is economics, right? It's the core of the economy. So I want to talk about energy, I want to talk about CO2 emissions, and I want to talk about geopolitics, and I wanted to bring this all together. So I do think you really need to pay attention to the questions that the students ask, because they're very heavily, I mean, I'm appreciative of them. I was really honored to be, talking to these students, and I welcome the opportunity to do it again. But something I really want to tell the oil and gas industry is listen to this. Listen to the questions that these students are giving me. And it really tells me something. It tells me that the oil and gas industry has invested a lot in having their name on a placard or a billboard or owning a building, but they have not invested enough in teaching these students, these petroleum engineering students, about energy, about not just oil and gas, but about petroleum more broadly, and about geopolitics and how it works in the global economy, and actually having them understand how this works, because the questions are heavily tilted with regards to climate change and with regards to CO2 emissions. And there's so many other things that have to be discussed within this context. And I think you really, really hear this in this question. So that is just something I want to flag for the industry that you absolutely need to pay attention to. And I welcome the opportunity. I want to speak at School of Mines. I want to actually teach at Colorado School of Mines. And, I know the mining industry has endowments where they have teachers that their job is paid for by the industry, and their job is to make sure that mining is present and being taught at the Colorado School of Mines, and that students understand this. So I just think this is something for the oil and gas industry to realize and appreciate it, because it doesn't seem that that is coming out, especially within petroleum engineering. But with that said, I really want to thank the Colorado School of Mines and the students for taking their time to listen to me. I was exceptionally appreciative of the fact. So we're going to rip through all that. But lastly, I just want to conclude with a couple things. If you're thinking about what are the biggest things to look at, and what are clients asking me, and what am I thinking about in 2025, and why you should become a client or a partner of PetroNerds, is two things. I think is that, political volatility, obviously from South Korea to Canada, that's going to continue to be a theme. But when it comes to China, I think the role of China, the lack of understanding of China, I talk about this a lot, but it cannot be underscored enough here, because I think what we're hearing is so much little information is understood about China, that whenever something comes out, we get sort of sound bites. And so every time oil prices move up or down, there's usually a China note, right? Is that prices are down because people are worried about China. Well, that was the case last night, right? The Chinese inflation is flat, and basically they're staring down the barrel of deflationary territory, and that's really problematic. And so you have a lot of people talking about China, whether or not they what's going on with the economy. They're actually thinking they're going to subsidize everything from microwaves to EVs to get people to spur purchases. Well, if you're not confident in the economy, yeah, you can do that, but what is that really going to do? So I think that you need to put a big, flag and question mark and concern around Chinese economy, and the fact that the government is actually probably, they know what they're doing, they know how to fix it, they're not fixing it, and that is intentional. And so there are a lot of implications for that. There's also a really interesting article, an opinion piece, within the Wall Street Journal, or sorry, it's within the Financial Times, that I just wanted to put out. Okay, so this is an opinion piece, an op-ed from the Financial Times, and it's the title is "Xi has a plan for retaliating against Trump's gamesmanship," and I think it's really fascinating, because you're going to hear a lot about this, right? Everybody's talking about what are tariffs going to be under Trump against China. This is already permeating within the market. I hear this in the oil industry. If you're exposed on pipe, I mean, there's a number of things that are going to be important to watch when it comes to China. But something this writer says, and I think is fascinating, is it says, quote, "If Donald Trump's China policy is defined by uncertainty and contradiction, Xi Jinping's strategy is defined by clarity and determination." That sentence, I can tell you folks, there's nothing probably more wrong in terms of how I think, and I'm not talking about Trump's policy, I'm talking about China. China has, it's not determination and clarity. I mean, there's nothing clear about Chinese strategy other than the intent is to not be clear, right? A part of the big thing that you see within a theme within China is that they lean into contradiction and they lean into that cloudiness, and the fact that we don't know what's going on in the economy allows a lot of people to just judge and make stuff up. And so I think it's really, really important. If I was going to tell you to watch, the biggest things to watch is the Chinese economy, is China's, the coverage of it is obviously what happens under the Trump administration. But in oil prices, I do think they're too hot. And I think that, Trump has said something. He said, if the hostages from Gaza do not get released, there's going to be hell to pay. Well, that has definitely lit a fire under everyone in the Middle East. And they're looking to cut a deal. And that means that there will be massive pushback on Iran. So we are definitely going to be sanctioning Iran. Well, if we have 13.5 million barrels a day of production, that gives Trump some levers that he could say, hey, let's reduce regulations. Let's see what it's going to take to increase output. He's going to be helped because if you have higher natural gas prices, that's definitely going to help. But you need to watch Iran. You need to watch sanctions on Iran. You need to watch sanctions on China or attacks on tariffs on China, things that we are directly talking about China as a threat. And then I think Russia is a big wild card here, is that if we get a deal, if there's something cut between Russia and Ukraine, which it seems like both entities are obviously trying to bargain for that, putting a lot of chips on the table right now. You're seeing a lot of ramp up in aggressiveness from Ukraine and from Russia on both sides. So if we don't see a deal being cut, you're going to have to see the U.S. further sanction or further go after Russia, and that's going to be problematic, right? That is something that could put pressure on upside oil prices. And again, there's levers that if the global economy is weakening and we have all the supply and we can ask Saudi Arabia to increase more output, there's things that we can do to fix this. So I do think oil prices in many ways can help solve this, but I don't think you're going to want, under the current state of the global economy and under at least half of the U.S. is just not doing well, and definitely impacted by inflation. I don't think that the Trump administration is going to want to see $75 oil. And I think that's something that the oil industry needs to appreciate, is that not just from what Trump wants to see, but also what is healthy for the U.S. economy and global economy is lower oil prices than probably we're actually seeing today. Okay, so lastly, I'm going to close this. I have a lot of people asking me about future speaking engagements. And unfortunately, I have had to say no to a couple because they simply just don't work with the schedule and they're unpaid. So I apologize for that. But what's on the docket right now is next week, January 16th, here in Denver, Colorado, at the Denver Earth Resources Library, which I'm on the board. I will be speaking and giving a talk to DAPL, the Denver Association of Petroleum Landmen. So really excited and pumped about that. That's going to be a complete deep dive and rip, really getting into details of what I just talked about just now. I'm also agreed to speak at the Montana Tech Symposium in April of this year. So I think it's April 10th and 11th. I'm going to be doing a keynote talk and fireside chat, and then I'm going to be moderating with some speakers on the second day. So that's April 10th and 11th. And really importantly, it's not even announced yet, so I'm going to be the first to do it. I was invited to speak at the Houston Producers Forum. So really, really excited about that. I will be speaking at the Houston Producers Forum on March 18th, 25. So absolutely pumped about that, and really, really honored to be invited to speak. So I will be in Houston, looking to talk to folks and talk meetings and everything. So really, really pumped about that. But with that, folks, thank you so much for listening. Happy New Year to everyone. Really look forward to working with you guys and having you guys listen and getting the feedback, which has already been phenomenal this year. But if you are interested in sponsoring the podcast, and there will be a couple this year that are going to start this month, look, I want people to think about not as a sponsorship, but as partnership, partnering with PetroNerds so that we can get information out there, so that this podcast continue to be free and this information can be out in the market and available to the industry and otherwise in and outside the oil and gas industry. So thank you guys so much. Sponsorship, partnership, please think about it, and we'll talk soon. Bye. Admittedly, this was a little bit last minute. So I put this together, and we're going to sort of try to do this what's happening in the world, geopolitics, all the exciting stuff, what's going on in energy, contextualizing it, giving you the reality of traditional fuels. I call those crude oil, natural gas, and coal, and putting this all together in roughly 30 minutes, and then we can open this up, or depending on how long it takes to get through it, and then we can open it up to Q&A. And I'm going to pack a lot of information in, and welcome for you guys to push back, hard questions, whatever you like. like. But I am third generation oil and gas. I care deeply about this business, but I'm really, really passionate about energy, really, really passionate about data, and really education and getting information into hands of whether it's a CEO or whether it's students to actually understand what you guys are doing. And I will say it is one of the greatest businesses in the entire world. It is really exciting, it's really fun, and it's unlimited knowledge. You can just keep learning and learning and doing more. So this is sort of a synopsis. Well, it's really geopolitical energy economics in a nutshell. And some of the biggest topics I want to hit on or front load, this is what I often do with my presentations and talks, is to sort of run a show. The things that I want to make sure we emphasize is energy is economics. Energy is the economy, and energy is geopolitics. So you don't have any business. It's not just a segment of the economy. Energy is the economy. All businesses, everything runs on energy. And it's really, really critical to understand that, because I actually just got back from Europe. And one of the first things you see when you fly into Germany is their net zero 2050 sign in the Munich airport, which is a little bit annoying because how truthful is that? And then you see another big sign that says green, and it's got green moss and everything on it. And the point I'm saying to this is there's a lot of talk about going green, but the realities of doing it are very, very different. And we're already seeing this in the data. We're already seeing this in the economic reality of Germany, which I'll show you in a little bit. And then I want to point out that everybody calls it fossil fuels, and I don't, because I think oil is not a fossil. It's not dead. When you say fossil fuels, it has an old connotation, it has a dead connotation. It's not dead, and it's a very thriving industry. It's over 100 million barrels per day of demand, over 100 million barrels per day of production, and the energy transition is not clean, green, or cheap. And so we're going to dispel some of those misnomers in case those are what we're thinking. Traditional fuels are oil, natural gas, and coal, as I pointed out. And then traditional fuel consumption, as I'll show you in this data, it's not falling. Now, we can talk about oil demand growth and where oil demand is at and why the economy in China is looking very rough and how that's impacting oil prices and why we have $70 oil when we have multiple hot wars going on. But that's demand growth may be slowing from an economic perspective, but actual consumption for oil is not falling. And to get to your net zero 2050 plans, you would have aggressive reductions in demand for oil by 2030, you have to reduce 25 million barrels a day of demand. The U.S. is the largest oil and gas producer in the world. You guys probably know that. But I don't think a lot of people in the world know that. Certainly the Biden administration does not talk about that. They may say that a little bit now because they're up for re-election, but they don't say the number. 13.2 million barrels a day is more than any country in the world has ever produced. And we're doing it month after month consistently with far less rigs. And I'll show you that in a little bit. But it's really, really important to put that in context because we have rising electricity prices in the U.S. and an unstable system in the U.S. with regards to those rising electricity prices, and yet we're the largest oil and natural gas producer in the world. We should not have escalating electricity prices in the U.S. And just so you know, and most of you do, there's 500,000 barrels a day being produced just an hour from here in Weld County. And some of these realities, you guys probably know this, but a lot of your peers may not know it. And certainly a lot of the folks in Denver that are downtown Denver have no idea that there's 500,000 barrels a day of oil production an hour from downtown Denver. Global power generation by fuel and why it matters to geopolitics matters a great deal. So we're going to talk about global power generation or thinking about electricity and how it's broken out and what it actually looks like. And that matters a great deal because it shows you that it's going to be very, very difficult, if possible at all, to actually hit your CO2 emissions targets from a net zero or any perspective. And then Europe is really accelerating this destruction of their economy through their grid and their really aggressive green policies and the energy transition. And they're kind of giving us a case study of what not to do. So what you see is a sort of forced failing, very fiscally irresponsible energy transition or energy policies that's really hurting consumers, and it's hurting businesses and manufacturers. So the other big thing is that Europe is industrial heartland. I mean, manufacturing at GM, or think about manufacturing in Germany from BMW or Rolls-Royce or any of these companies, and think about all the countries around them which support those industries. They're all getting decimated, and one of the biggest reasons they're getting decimated, well, they have competition from China, but the second is they have very escalating electricity costs that are really making their businesses unprofitable. So it's just really, you're seeing a direct impact to these manufacturers, and right now you have over half of the auto manufacturing capacity in Germany sitting idle. So that is your BMWs, that is your Rolls Royce, that is the auto manufacturer of the world, and they're not, and they're half of it sitting idle because they can't compete partly because they have very high energy costs. So if you have not listened to the podcast, there's a wealth of knowledge in it. A lot of students actually listen to it, but really a lot of CEOs and a lot of industry leaders listen to it because I pack a lot into it. I'll probably turn this into a podcast as well, but please check it out. Okay, so I have really a short amount of time to tell you about the state of energy and condense it. And so rough run a show, I really want to touch on, some of the themes I just mentioned, but the current market and the economy. Oil prices tell you a lot about the global economy. So the fact that we have $70 oil, we touched down to 64, we go back up to 75, but now we're at 70-ish. And we have two hot wars. We have Israel fighting a three-front war in the Middle East, and we don't have higher oil prices, really means that, one, you have a lot of supply. Two, you have a lot of spare capacity. And three, you do not have a demand growth story. So the economy, the global economy, is not ripping, it's not roaring, and it's not going the way a lot of people think. And you see that within a lot of the stuff that the Saudis are signaling. And this is the fun macro stuff that everybody likes to talk about. So we'll talk about that a little bit. And then, geopolitics, there's a really imperative to understand the granularity of energy. So to really understand what does the grid look like around the world? What is the power generation by a given country and why that matters? And it matters because electricity prices, natural gas, how much of natural gas or how much of coal is into the grid? What are your actual prices for your natural gas versus what are your prices that you're paying when it comes into the grid via electricity? Baseload power generation, coal. Right now what we have where you see it in Germany or whether you see it in the US or you see it in places like Colorado. In Colorado, we have a lot of wind in our grid. We still have a decent amount of coal, but we've added wind, we've decommissioned coal, and we haven't really added a lot of natural gas. And so what you see is a direct correlation between price. When you add wind, there's a direct correlation between the price of electricity in Colorado. And that the problem is that you don't have dispatchable power. So the dispatchable baseload power is your coal power or your natural gas-fired power generation. So it's really critical that people understand that if you decommission all the coal, you have to add natural gas. And if you don't have the natural gas, you're going to have intermittent, unreliable, very, very expensive power generation because the power density of wind is 1,000 times less than natural gas. So by the time I get wind energy into these light bulbs or anything, I've lost so much power, same with solar, that that's partly why it's very, very expensive. So you also have China's role, and it's hard for folks to talk about this, one, because I think a lot of people don't understand the Chinese economy. Two, they don't understand Chinese policies, but really they don't understand China and energy. China has a very big outsized role in this energy transition because they produce, or so-called energy transition, because they produce a lot of the green tech. They produce a lot of batteries. They nearly almost exclusively process all of the critical minerals. So all the refining for rare and critical minerals, whether it's magnesium, lithium, graphite, all of it's processed and refined within China because it's pretty dirty. It's very energy intensive. It's not environmentally friendly. And so China does that with cheap and forced labor and with coal-fired power generation that they further subsidize. So they're able to outcompete anyone. So even if you build a battery here, you're buying the refined components from China. So there are a lot of issues with that. But then those cheap input costs, low-cost labor or forced labor and cheap coal, which is further subsidized, it makes it impossible for anybody to compete, especially if you're an Italian manufacturer or if you're a German manufacturer. It's really, really hard for anybody to compete in this, so you don't have a level playing field. So there's many things with this going green that is really decimating manufacturing within the Western world. And you see that within the data within power, and you actually see it in the CO2 emissions as well, because as Europe has worked really hard to reduce their CO2 emissions, they basically just killed their manufacturing sector and sent it to China. And so their CO2 emissions have come down, but China's has went up. So you played whack-a-mole with CO2 emissions, and you haven't done a damn thing in terms of actually reducing CO2 emissions. And the fact that it's the end of 2024, and we have as much green aggressive policymaking right now going on with that, and we don't have people talking about the actual data and where we're at and the story behind that, it's pretty alarming. And you see it in the data, so we'll show that as well. So the biggest questions I would say some of the biggest client questions or people that are talking about right now is really, why are oil prices so low despite these two hot wars, one in Europe and one in the Middle East, and a lot of just escalating geopolitical tensions. I study the geopolitics for a living. I do national security work, and I would say it is a really, really tense geopolitical time. So in theory, you should have much higher oil prices than you do right now. And then so you have U.S. production, because we have a lot of production. You have Saudi production at
less than 9 million barrels per day. So that's a really big deal. And then you have the Chinese economy and softness and just overall the global economy, especially in Europe, which is all contributing to these lower prices. And then you have this US election, which is just, it's very hard for people to talk about. I'm surprised that the oil and gas industry and the energy industry hasn't been more vocal about it, because it doesn't matter how you feel about either candidate. The policies are very, very stark. If you want to go down the path that you're going right now, which is a very anti-domestic oil and gas administration, that's where you're going to get with Harris. If you want the same policies on Ukraine, which is just not win the war, not end the war, just keep funding, that's where you're going to get with Harris. And people are really clear about stuff like that, about policies on Ukraine. They needed to extrapolate that and take that forward for energy, because that's the same thing that we'll have with energy. And so we have a lot of uncertainty with the election. That's a lot of what people are talking about. The implications for the U.S. grid, for the role of natural gas, are huge. Just permitting LNG export facilities, the ability to build infrastructure. It's hard to build a pipeline, but it would obviously be very, very different under Trump versus Harris. And then the policies globally, whether we have sanctions on Iran for crude. Will we enforce those sanctions? And that has huge implications for oil prices. If we actually sanction the crude that Iran exports to China and we don't let them export it, that means the Saudis can increase production. That means that we can keep our production up and the Saudis can increase production. So the implications on a foreign policy perspective are huge. So what do I think is being missed and not talked about? It's what oil prices are telling us. They're really telling us that we have some serious concerns with demand. China was never consuming 17 million barrels a day that the IEA, the International Energy Agency, or OPEC said that they were consuming the past 2 years. 17 million barrels a day is huge. That means they would have had massive demand growth when their economy is backsliding, when they've had zero COVID measures and lockdowns. That's not real. A lot of that's stockpiling. But that also means that there's real weakness within China, which people are starting to see, but there's weakness obviously in Europe, and then we're not growing demand here. And it's not because we bought a bunch of EVs. EV sales are in the doldrums. They're absolute crap right now. You cannot resell an EV. So it's not EV penetration. It's the fact that this economy has shifted pretty significantly during and since COVID, and we had a lot of inflation, and that inflation has run up against with gasoline prices, and people can control something. They can control how much they're driving, or they try to, and they can pull back. So we've sort of had basically flat gasoline consumption in the US. So that's being missed. And then this primary energy consumption, which I'll show you quickly and get into these charts, is that, actually looking at primary energy consumption. So how much is the world using for coal? How much is the world using for natural gas? How much is the world using for oil? And how much renewables? And it's predominantly still traditional fuels, coal, oil, and natural gas. But the breakup of that matters a great deal because the US still uses about 30% oil, which means about 30% is still road fuels, is still transportation. That's not the case in China. In China, over half of primary energy consumption is electricity. It's coal and it's power. And so that means no one's thinking about that, but that means that that's how they've planned and tilted their economy, which means they are a manufacturing powerhouse. They were a manufacturing powerhouse. They're going to be a manufacturing powerhouse. They are never getting off coal. They're 100% energy secure in coal, and they're going to keep using it. So it is not behoove of the West or the OECD to kill themselves to decommission our baseload power, our coal-fired power, and which also hurts our ability to actually uptake more natural gas and get all the benefits of natural gas, while we just allow China to increase. It's a really, really bad policy making. It impacts competition and global competition hugely, and it's having significant knock-on consequences already in manufacturing. Okay, so Saudi Arabia is absolutely signaling right now. We'll get into the fun geopolitical oil stuff up front, and then we'll get into the power generation stuff. So we have oil prices, no matter, they've kind of stopped the game of cutting. They can't really cut further. They're holding the bag for everyone in OPEC with producing a little bit under 9 million barrels per day. But that also means that they have the spare capacity. If the Saudis are producing 9 million barrels per day, it's going to be pretty easy for them to add a couple million barrels a day back onto the market. And that's what's keeping a floor on oil prices despite all the geopolitical tensions. And then you have the constant signaling the last month or so. You've seen articles come out in the Financial Times and the Wall Street Journal talking about $50 oil. They're not targeting $50 oil. They're not expecting it. They don't want it. But they're willing to take a little pain for longer because the system of where they just keep cutting and 9 million barrels per day at $70 oil, the math's not working. So, but they are budgeting now for less, for having a fiscal deficit and for writing this out. And so I don't think you can expect to see sustainably high oil prices from an economic perspective. We can definitely get them from geopolitical volatility. We can have spikes, but if we get if we get in the U.S. $80, $90 oil, it's going to help you push the economy into recession. So the implications for that are really, really big. So just one data point, a lot of people talk about the Chinese economy. A lot of people don't know about the Chinese economy. They just released a treasure trove of stuff on the stock market to try to boost the stock market before their holiday, and then everything declined because it wasn't enough. Things to look at, Chinese data is not, you can't take any single data point, but something to look at is like cement output. Well, if you were demanding 17 million barrels a day, your cement output wouldn't be down. Your cement output is telling you you're building stuff. What are you doing? And so the Chinese economy, just the point in this is that it is not in good shape. You have a property sector that is most definitely in decline. Something like 90 million units are sitting empty, and it's just an absolute mess. And the government doesn't actually want to save it. There's a lot of incentive for the Chinese government to actually lean into a slower growth economy, especially from an energy perspective. So switching back, U.S. is the largest oil and gas producer in the world. Extremely impressive. These are production charts that you guys have probably seen, but it's really important to just think about this, nerd out with this. If you know how many wells are behind this, the productivity, how many rigs, what we've done in the past several years, despite coming out of COVID and then this volatility in oil prices, has been really, really significant. And I point that out because this has all happened not because of the Biden administration, but in spite of them. So day one we had an executive order to pull the permit for Keystone XL. The next we had the climate change executive order 14008. We actually had a 2-month ban on all permitting on federal land, including tribal land, which was not legal. But for 2 months there was a 60-day ban on all permits on federal land for oil and gas. So if you were in New Mexico, in the heart of the Permian Basin and the Delaware Basin, and you had federal land, you got a permit the day Biden came into office, it actually got pulled. And that is just not good for business. It's really, really difficult. So day one, we've seen this, and there's a lot of incremental policymaking, but it's really impressive to know how much we've climbed up production in spite of all that. And natural gas production, that's that purple line, we're producing 125 billion cubic feet per day. And we have we probably have 75 direct, rigs just targeting dry natural gas. You guys know this, it's a small molecule, it's easy to produce. We know how to frack this. I love the frack side of the business. I love the completion side of the business. The technological feats that the service sector has done over the past couple of years, and really the whole industry over the past 20 years, has been absolutely incredible. And you see this not just in production data, but you see this when you just think about this with price. So you can't see that line really well, but I always put production against oil prices just to point out something very simple, is that production growth happens despite really where prices are at. So we had this nice run up before COVID when we had much lower oil prices. And yes, we've had a run up in price, but really we are running up regardless of where price is at. And that's because we are doing a lot more with less. The industry now is more profitable than it's ever been, and we have lower oil prices. And at $70, $80 oil, U.S. shale is very, very profitable. And even on the private sector, where you have a lot less of the ESG burdens and a lot less of the energy transition burdens, it's still very, very profitable in the private sector, and it's why it's really thrived. So U.S. natural gas production and prices, this is I'm desperately passionate about this because I'm extremely frustrated when I see my Excel, my energy bill, my utility bill, and I see how much it's gone up, and I know how much natural gas is in my U.S. grid, which is 50% of our grid is natural gas, which means all of you should be seeing deflation when you pay your electricity bills. You all should have had a big, check coming back to you, much lowering prices. Just like when oil prices go up and you go to the gasoline pump, you see gasoline prices go up, but you also see gasoline prices go down when oil prices go down. And utility companies are not passing along this very, very low natural gas price of $2 and sub $2 for most of this year, record low natural gas prices this year. They're not passing that off to the consumer. And that's a really, really big deal that most of the consumers don't know about and need to, and something that the oil and gas industry needs to get better involved with and more vocalized. So that's natural gas production, 125 billion cubic feet per day. That's more than a quarter of global gas consumption. So you guys probably are familiar, the world consumes and produces about 100 million barrels a day of oil, and it's about 400 billion cubic feet per day globally for natural gas production and consumption. So we're over a quarter of that, which is just an incredible and amazing feat. So rig count, lateral length, also a nerdy chart. No one cares about the rig count anymore. It's actually pretty impressive, the fact that the rig count just continues to decline. We have so many less rigs than we did even coming out of COVID, and yet we're producing 13.2 million barrels a day. So we're able to maintain our production and drop our rig count because the efficiencies on drilling. You can spud to TD a 3-mile long lateral now in a week and change, in 8 days and 9 days. And every time I talk to operators and engineers in the field and CEOs and clients, they always tell me, oh, we probably hit our limit, we're probably hitting the efficiency. And then I talk to them a few months later and they say, oh, we broke another record. And so we're probably hitting our limitation of really, drilling faster. But there's a lot to be said about this. And it's something I emphasize a lot with folks is that whenever we have a downturn in the oil and gas sector, particularly in shale, since it started really in earnest in 2008, the industry slows down and they study the rock. And so the better knowledge you have of the rock, if you're just landing that lateral a little bit better in zone, and that means you frack it a little bit better, everything's getting better. So what's happened during COVID and what's so impressive post coming out of COVID was you had tons of private operators that were all stepping out of core acreage. They were going outside of the core, and they were making it work. And so all these efficiencies, they were just doing things a little bit better. And so incrementally, when we do a little bit better, it has an impact, which you see in that production. So our lateral lengths, our lateral lengths have just continued to gone up. So we're now at over, on average, every single well of the thousands of wells that we're drilling, on average are over 2 miles long. And that's a meaningful, because it means you don't have to drill as many wells as you did before. But it also means that you see consistently 3-4 mile long laterals in the Permian Basin, which is really impressive, because 5 years ago, a lot of people would have told you that you could not effectively complete, or they were not comfortable necessarily effectively completing the toe of that well. And now I would say you're still going to be able to get better. It's not perfect, but you see it within the productivity. This is every shale basin. This is Wilson Basin, this is Powder River Basin, this is DJ, this is Anadarko Basin, this is the Permian, this is the Eagle Ford, all together, all normalized for a 10,000 foot lateral length. And that's your productivity, your decline curve, which you guys I'm sure are very familiar with. The fact that we had people wildcatting natural gas wells, the fact that we had all these private companies stepping out, and that this decline curve is right here and hasn't really declined, is just really, really impressive, and just shows you how operators have done it, but also how much the service companies have responded in kind in the last couple of years. Okay, so we're switching back. Primary energy consumption, this is the world. So a lot of people know this, but you have to really think about it. This is 2023, it's the latest data. Over about 82% of primary energy consumption globally is coal, natural gas, and oil. And the rest is 8.2% is your renewable, and that is wind and solar. And that 8.2%, I would argue that the more you add that, you're still not going to break that pie. You're actually going to need more coal, more natural gas, because you have to have that baseload power generation. And that's really what you're seeing in China, because they have so much wind and solar. A lot of that's more for energy security, but they have to have the baseload power generation with coal. This is global oil production and consumption. So this is where I'm dispelling that we're declining. This is kind of one trajectory. It's not perfect. We had a downturn in COVID, but that's your consumption is in orange, your production's in purple. It's not perfect when you think about production and consumption, but focus on that orange chart. That's over around 100 million barrels per day. That's going one direction. That's coming out of COVID. So it's certainly not declining. This is natural gas production and consumption. So it's about, like I said, 400 billion cubic feet per day. And so the International Energy Agency just came out 2 days ago with their big annual report. And I didn't even put it in here because the stuff is kind of insane in terms of their projections. But you have to take the oil demand, and you have to take 25 million barrels a day off of your current oil demand by 2030. And for natural gas, it's even worse. And so it's very impossible, but it's not just impossible because that's the direction it's going. It's impossible because it's the non-OECD or the developing world that's consuming a lot of this. This is your global coal consumption. So everything the IEA has said, everything that people are saying, everybody here on TV, everything you see in the market, Wall Street Journal, FT, everything, stock market, turn on the stock market. They don't color and context oil and gas well, or even coal at all. And you wouldn't know that this is how much coal the world is consuming, that it's actually all-time record highs coming out of COVID, because this is electricity, and this is producing things. You can't produce anything. You can't make something in this world without natural gas or coal right now. I mean, and maybe you'll be able to do it with batteries. It's definitely not there yet, and it's ridiculously expensive. Nuclear, you definitely can do it, but it's very hard to build a nuclear reactor or anything. this is your global power generation by fuel. So this is every country in the entire world. You have about 30,000 terawatt hours of global power generation for everybody. And keep that 30,000 in context, because there's a great story that's coming here. 30,000 terawatt hours. That is coal up here. It's over 10,500 terawatt hours. Natural gas over 6,700 terawatt hours. Then you got hydro, and you got your renewables right here. That's the entire world. China makes up 1/3 of that total. So of that 30,000, China is 9,500 terawatt hours of that. So unless you are going to curb what China is doing, unless you're going to change their grid, you are not going to change the emissions profile of the world. So you can kill yourself in Europe and you can kill yourself in the US. And it's really frustrating to me that in Colorado, we are working so hard to lower CO2 emissions in Colorado to the detriment of businesses, to the detriment of consumers, when Colorado is less than 0.24% of global CO2 emissions. So Colorado could disappear off the map and it would not do a damn thing to global CO2 emissions. And so this is where it's really hard when we're talking about policy, that this is what's happening, and policies are aggressively going against or pushing back against energy. And so it's going to be very hard for businesses and households to actually heat their homes. But this is US power generation, just total power generation, not coal, this is just total. So you can see China going up, US flatlining. There's serious consequences for that, well beyond just CO2, obviously way beyond CO2 emissions. That is not the number one issue that's happening in the world. Big consequences in terms of just competition, just the ability to manufacture something. An airplane, restocking ammunition, that we've been using all the ammunition around the world right now in many, many hot wars. You have to actually make things. If you've noticed where, Russia has had a series of different attacks on Ukraine, but a lot of them have targeted energy infrastructure, particularly power plants, so they cannot produce things, so they can't make missile defense systems to actually protect their country. So we often people talk about energy and they think about war and oil, and they talk about the ability to, wars being fought over oil, but they forget to talk about how wars are actually fought with airplanes that are produced from energy, and that's a really serious thing. So I'm going to have to go over my time. So we'll go through this fast. So that's your Chinese power generation by fuel. That's your coal. So you have over 5,000 terawatt hours of coal-fired power generation. We don't even have 5,000 terawatt hours of power generation in the US. So this is the battle we have on the coal problem with China and the US. And I'm not saying that you should decommission all your coal. It's definitely not as clean. It's definitely not nearly as, natural gas is a very clean, energy-dense fuel, so it makes a lot of sense because we have a ton of it in the US. But the problem is when we aggressively decommission that coal-fired power generation, we no longer get the benefits of natural gas because natural gas is very low price. But when we have these price spikes, we can always go back to coal, and we can use it really well, and we can actually lower emissions and have increased consumption of natural gas. Now what we're seeing is as we decommission coal and we have so much natural gas, we get a little bit of volatility with those prices of natural gas, which we never saw before. So this is your OECD. So that's your, that's your OECD. So you have about 11,000 terawatt hours of power generation. That's your developed world. That's the US, Europe. That is your non-OECD. So that's Africa, that's a lot of the Middle East, and that's a lot of Asia. And that is almost 19,000 terawatt hours. So it's double. And then if you look at oil and gas consumption, you can see the same story. So you see oil and gas consumption going one direction for the non-OECD and declining or flatlining in the developed world. And then coal consumption, the most important thing here is that, this is our OECD coal consumption and our non-OECD coal consumption. So hardly any coal consumption in the developed world and just going breakneck with the developing world. And that's largely where your CO2 emissions are coming from. So OECD CO2 emissions, down, declining, and non-OECD OECD CO2 emissions are way up. And then China constitutes more than half of global coal consumption. So that is Chinese coal consumption, and that is global coal consumption, which is way up, and China is more than half of that. So global CO2 emissions, and I'm going to go through these really fast, so don't worry. Global CO2 emissions, that's your black line. It's over 40,000. It's million gigatons. These numbers are a little funky how they say them. China is 12,600 of that 40. And so that's on one axis, that 40, and all these on the other axis. The US is 5,100. India is 3,100. EU 2,700. So we are way, way, way less than China. Significantly less, and it's actually declining. This is just a nerdy chart to show you that. It corresponds to GDP. The interesting story with the US is that we have declining CO2 emissions and we have a rising GDP. And with China, it's the opposite. Their economy is actually declining and their CO2 emissions are rising. And it's only going to continue to go that way because they will double down on coal. If the economy is good, they'll double down on coal, and if the economy is bad, they're going to double down on coal. So this is Chinese CO2 emissions, and that is US CO2 emissions. And there's a direct correlation with that decline, that massive decline in US CO2 emissions with our natural gas in our grid. So that's Chinese primary energy consumption, what I mentioned before. That's more than half coal. They have a little bit natural gas. But the real story is this is it's not transportation. I mean, they have transportation here, but all the EVs that you hear about and see in China they're just plugging those in to the grid, and those are being run by coal. And that's really to help protect them from all the rising import exposure that they have from oil. U.S. primary energy consumption, what I said before, it's still a lot oil. The fact that the U.S. it tells you a lot about the economy. You still see this in Europe. The fact that a decent amount of our economy it's consumers, it's driving to and from things. So when we see that big disparity, it's not something I'm hearing anyone talk about. The fact that China is coal and we are still predominantly oil and gas. And then non-OECD, you can see that it looks a lot like China's. So this is the IEA. They just came out with this the other day, 2 days ago, and they said geopolitical tensions are laying bare fragilities in the global energy system, reinforcing the need for a faster expansion of clean energy. So all the stuff I'm talking about is absolutely in the data that I study and see is telling you can't go faster. It's breaking down as you see it. And they're saying, no, go faster. And so what they're basically just telling you is that we have to aggressively go faster. And the result is that these economies are declining. Your projected AI demand, and I think you have to be a little careful with this because this will change over time. But Goldman Sachs is probably the estimate everyone's using. It's 1,000 terawatt hours. So they're projecting growth of 1,000 terawatt hours just for AI. And I told you we were 4,500 terawatt hours. So think about 1,000 terawatt hours is the entire grid of Japan that we need to add just for artificial intelligence. And in places like North Dakota, where they have ample natural gas and they can't build a pipeline to move it, you have AI facilities coming into North Dakota. They're going to direct line into natural gas, and it's really cold in North Dakota. It gets, negative 40 often. So they don't have to worry about heating, cooling these facilities. But AI, these guys are talking about building nuclear. But right now they're all largely powered direct line into natural gas, and they're backed up with diesel because they cannot afford to go out. And the point I'm making with this is that anything of consequence, anything that's going to build your economy, anything that's going to give you a job, anything that's going to make money, that all comes from energy. And it does not come from wind and solar power. By the way, crappy wind and solar power are made in China with forced labor and coal. So if the energy transition is happening, it's pretty amazing that the things driving the economy and the market all correspond to traditional fuels, particularly oil and gas. So you have a lot of talk about data centers, which I just pointed out. You have a talk about just today about how Europe's battery manufacturing is just getting decimated. That's partly from the energy side. And then I talked about the Iran sanctions, and then you have Israel theoretically, or saying that they killed the leader of Hamas. All of this impacts oil because this is regional. If we look at Germany power generation by fuel, because I mentioned this is the story of what not to do. This means your economy is declining. You can't electrify everything. You can't do what the IEA says and go green if you're not actually adding power to your grid. And the fact that Germany has just tanked off a cliff, they have all this wind in their grid and they've declined. They have the most expensive, I think Netherlands is more expensive than they are. They're the second highest electricity costs in the world. And there's a direct correlation between high electricity costs and wind and solar penetration in your grid. And I promise I'm almost done. This is the US, really, really important. If you take nothing home, this is our electricity prices in the US. This comes from the US Bureau of Labor Statistics. We were flat for a long time, 14 cents a kilowatt hour. In 4 years under the Biden administration, we have gone up to 18 cents a kilowatt hour. And this is killing businesses. And we are way less than Europe, but it's still really, really high. And yet we're the largest producer of oil and gas in the entire world. And there is a direct correlation between not just wind and solar penetration in the grid, but companies like Excel has continued to pass on rate increases to the consumer. They're in fact passing on rate increases for natural gas to pay for the renewables. And so they not only have to pay for the renewables that they're adding, which is very, very expensive, they have to decommission the coal, which is really, really expensive, and they're not bearing the cost of that. They're passing that on to the consumer. And there's really no recourse for the consumer, which is pretty insane and something I would like to fight back on. And this is your chart. This is from JP Morgan. This is the direct correlation around the world, what we've already seen. When you add wind and solar into the grid, you have a direct correlation with rising electricity prices. And that really impacts your competitiveness. And lastly, this is Colorado. So this is just Colorado electricity prices. This is a report that I did with the Common Sense Institute, which I'm an energy fellow. And this is the grid. And there's a direct correlation between that little uptick in wind right here with electricity prices. And in fact, when wind flatlines or declines a little bit, electricity prices actually decline with it. So it's a really, really sad story when our grid looks a lot like Germany's, and it doesn't work because you have this natural gas that hasn't come up, you have this coal that's right there that's come up a little bit, but you have all this wind penetration. And the problem is that that's not just your baseload power, that's your dispatchable power. You have to be able to get it out. And electricity is really hard for people to understand. This is actually what I'll close with, and this is your CO2 emissions in the US. So that's that direct correlation dropping, and that is your grid. So that's coal coming down, that's natural gas coming up. And with that, I will close and open it up to any questions. Thank you.
Excuse me.
Yeah.
I see, first of all, I really thank you for your presentation, sponsoring this meeting. But I see this energy transition in another way. In fact, I'm seeing that it can be parallel to the oil industry. In fact, oil industry can contribute a lot to energy transition in spite of opposing the energy transition. What do you think about that?
I think that's what the oil and gas industry has done. And I'm just being very honest. I run my own business so I can be a straight shooter. And I don't think often, I can tell you that a lot of people aren't straight because they work for a company and they have a hard time talking about this. I think the oil and gas industry has really they leaned in because that's where they saw the direction going, right? I worked in Washington, D.C. I worked at a nonprofit. And I saw that all the time. Wherever the oil and gas industry would donate, wherever they thought the think tank was going to have the most influence, say with the Obama administration. And what happened when Biden was elected is you had a massive amount of tailwinds because there were all kinds of executive orders that were going pro-climate change, talking about it as an existential threat, not necessarily labeled, it is labeled as an existential threat, but not a crisis. And so there's all these tailwinds. And so business went there, right? All this money, the trillions of dollars that the Biden administration and Congress spent on energy, on the energy transition, on green stuff, that's where it was going. So, right, the oil and gas industry tends to, they're not good leaders in terms of, when they have a crisis, they kind of duck and cover. Think Exxon Valdez, think of the Deepwater Horizon, and this is the time where they've missed the boat. You got to really lead. You got to say what we do for a living and why we're proud of it and what it actually does, because no one's going to do that for you. So I think the industry has done a poor job in the last few years where they've leaned into it, and now they're back. You see they're backsliding a little bit, like and I'm honest about this, and ConocoPhillips knows it because I know some great people there. But they were the first company to actually talk about net zero 2050. So they put it on their slide deck and they said net zero 2050. Go look at their slide deck now. There's no net zero 2050 because they did all this, and then oil and gas companies are not making money on ESG investments. They actually cost them money. The billions that Exxon's doing are not making them money. They're trying to pacify some investor. They had the engine number 1 debacle and they've had boardroom debacles and everything, but it's not making the money. What's making the money is putting the drill bit back in the ground at $80 oil and producing oil and gas. That's where the returns are. So that's just a reality. So there's a lot of, I think we do get greenwashed in thinking that, well, look, they're investing a little bit in solar and wind. It's really, really expensive. I have not seen a single wind or solar project make money. They're all subsidized so heavily. And you got to realize that they're subsidized really, really heavily in China. So then they come here and people say, well, that can work. But when you look at levelized cost of energy or LCOE, you can't compare wind or solar to coal or natural gas because you don't have that. From a baseload dispatchable power, you would have to have batteries. And so the costs get really out of whack. So even with all the subsidies, wind and solar don't work. And that's why you see those high costs, those high prices in the grid. So personally, I really struggle with it. I struggle that it's not clean to begin with, that it's made from coal, it's made from a lot of forced labor. It's really cheap, and it's not good quality. The power density is not good. So I think, what are you trying to do? And I think instead of saving face, there needs to be a little more honesty. If it's what you want, if you want to build it here in the U.S. or you want to build it in a country that has a rule of law and standards, that's fine. I still don't think it's a great form of power generation if you want to make something or build something. So that's how I'm coming at it from an economic perspective. So I don't think I think we've kind of conflated things, saying we can be a part of this, and I think that's the industry thinking that would work. And clearly, under this administration, that hasn't worked. Trying to work with the administration has only went ahead and sent letters to the CEO of Exxon and the CEO of Chevron, yelling at them for asking them to pass on the cost of low-cost refinery, or cut out some of their fat in that and pass it to the consumer. But we don't see them writing a letter to the CEO of Excel, who's making $24 million a year, to pass the natural gas prices that he's paying 30 cents maybe an MCF here in Denver, he's not to pass on to the consumer. So it's really, really biased and it's really distorted. Yeah?
How did the US CO2 emissions go down? Is there a specific...
It's largely because of that. It's largely the single simplest biggest reason is because of natural gas. Because natural gas is just you moved coal out, so that black line is coal-fired power generation, and that red line is natural gas. And natural gas is extremely energy dense, and from a CO2 emissions perspective, it's much cleaner. And we also, the thing you have to appreciate is in the U.S., we have higher NOx and SOx, that's nitrous oxide and sulfur dioxide emissions. We have higher standards for NOx and SOx than any country in the world. So we have to do that. Even with the coal, we have to do that. So, and NOx and SOx are not the same as CO2. So in Europe, you can be aggressive on CO2, but you have higher NOx and SOx.
So do you still need to reduce CO2 emissions in terms of the environment and what's going on with the storms right now? That's the question.
If you're asking me, I don't. The biggest problem in the world. So one, no, I don't think you're gonna. If you think that the world is going to implode in a few years, which I don't think it is, and I'm not concerned about that. If you think that we're going to hit a certain degree Celsius target, I don't think you're controlling it. We've reduced our CO2 emissions in the US, we've reduced them in Europe, but China's increasing. So unless you're going to get China to stop, which you're not, you might rethink it. And I think it's the fact that it's political, the fact that it's been politicized, the fact that the Democratic Party is all in on climate. My dad and my grandfather were oil and gas, labored, pumped oil wells, and they were Democrats. I don't know. It's not a thing where you have Democrats that are like pro oil and gas. It's just not a thing now. That's pretty new in the U.S. Energy was not partisan, and it is now. So I think that's really true. Where it's been politicized, it's hard to realize that no, I don't think CO2 emissions are the biggest issue. I think the geopolitics and hot wars are much bigger. And I think if you believe that the world is burning, we're all going to die, then solar, wind, and batteries are the worst thing you could have because they don't perform in temperature. So if you believe in climate change, then you wouldn't buy an EV, and you sure as hell wouldn't put solar and wind into your grid because they don't perform. Wind doesn't blow when it's hot. Wind doesn't often blow when it's really, really cold. And the solar panels don't work when it's cloudy and it's snowing, and your battery doesn't work when it's really hot, or it loses its efficiency, and it doesn't work when it's really, really cold. So it just those things make no sense. And I think, in small countries, like I think you're alluding to in the, where we see anecdotal case studies where small countries are doing it, countries in Europe, they're really small countries. I mean, it's not like a big country like the US where you can do it. And the fact that California and Colorado are already trying this and they have the highest electricity prices in the country should tell us something, because it's barely started. So go ahead. And I can follow up with you. That's a good question. Yeah.
So you've talked a lot about wind and solar, but we've also seen a rise of research in geothermal. Do you think that will be effective in the US in the near future, or do you think that we're very far out from having that be a large part of our energy grid?
I think we're very far out from being a large part of the energy grid, largely from the ability of it's testing. People are starting it, and I just was talking to someone earlier today that was talking about trying it on site and on location to power a building in Denver. And so if it works, that's great. It's something that I think, as you know, the oil and gas industry and the frac side of the business is interested in dabbling with. But it's sort of like when people talk about it's not hydrogen, but is it scalable? And right now it's not. So it's, we can dabble with it. It could be, this could be effective if it works, but you're still going to have to drill for this. So not in the immediate term, but no, from a small scale solution, I think it's probably much more effective and reliable. It's really how much does it cost? And also, I don't know how much it costs right now, but it's got to be like the cost of this is what people aren't talking about. So we can, sit here and cry about CO2 emissions all day, but I can tell you the cost. You're not going to have an economy left you're not going to have people eating. So I care way more about people eating and human lives than and the ability to heat their homes, because the cost of this is really expensive, and no one talks about that. Is that the $240 trillion estimated cost to if you were to go to all wind and solar, which they can't because the technology isn't even there for the batteries. So geothermal is definitely a potential, but I think it's a ways off, and I haven't seen a lot of good numbers on it. But I do know of companies, and I know of buildings that are already dabbling with it and already trying it, largely because they're trying to hit they're trying to hit targets that individual states are setting. Yep.
So we discussed about like the importance of having oil and gas, and how we are proud of producing, like being the producing like oil and gas more than any other countries. But at the same time, we also talking about the climate change and the price of the electricity that other people pay, which is, I just check it with the Netherlands, they pay 3 times more than what we pay here in
Absolutely.
Europe. And then, so they do it for the good reason, because they do it because they need to stop the climate change. Otherwise, some country need to start like sacrificing, paying more, and just stop the climate change. I know that if they just stop using oil and gas, some other country like China going to start like producing more. But at some point, we as a United States need to do the same, because we need to reduce the amount of CO2 that we're producing. And also we see like the CO2 emission comparing the Europe versus US. We see that although both of them are reducing, but the Europe is just reducing with sharper like a slope. So.
But they've relegated, so their economy is also showing, so the you can make that argument, and you could sit here and we can debate that all day, but you haven't impacted, so all the aggressive reductions in US reductions and Europe has not resulted in global emissions reducing. In fact, it's increased it. And the reason it's increased it is because they're not producing it. Europe's economy is just going one direction. If they're not making the cars, and China is, but they're green, they get to feel good about themselves, but they haven't done anything on climate, and they no longer have an economy. They don't have the jobs to feed the people they have in their country. So we can all just not exist, and we can lower CO2 emissions like that. So if that's where you're going, but if you have no economy and China's making it, so they've actually increased CO2 emissions because they've relegated their manufacturing to China, and you have no control. China's going to do what's in the best interest of China, which is to have energy security with coal and to make things with very, very cheap coal-fired power generation. So if you really study, and you have to get really into the weeds on China, because people say, well, they're going green. No, they're not. They're most definitely not going green. They're using wind and solar as an addition when it works to backstop to help them with energy security with coal. So my response to that is, you're not lowering global CO2 emissions. You're patting yourselves on the back, and it's a lot like greenwashing, but it's at the detriment to these economies. So I would argue that they could have gone our route, and when you run combined cycle natural gas facilities like they do in Europe, the way they're doing it, say in the UK, they do it intermittently. So the only way you get the biggest benefit, the biggest bang for your buck, is to run it all out. So they actually, and you don't count in Europe, if you burn wood or you burn trash, they don't count that in CO2 emissions. It does produce CO2 emissions, it's just not counted. So there's a lot of stuff of magic math that doesn't actually compute. So I would say that, we should, if it's really about CO2 emissions, let us try to lower it, because I could take US LNG and I could push it into Asia, and I could lower CO2 emissions dramatically, because I could get Vietnam off coal, I could get the Philippines, I could get all these countries that actually would be beneficial for the world to lower, to use US natural gas. But I have policies like in the Biden administration where I'm banning the long-term permits, in the name of climate. But it's not actually helping climate. So I struggle with that a lot, because you would have to embrace natural gas if you were really about CO2, but that's not what's happening. And in Europe, it's sort of all in on wind and solar while keeping coal. And so it's if you study energy policy, what you end up realizing is a lot of bad energy policy has been made over the years. And so if your only thing is CO2 emissions, that's what they've done, and they haven't achieved it, except they see it on paper, they get it look good. But there's a lot of stuff in there that's not in there, like wood, like biomass, like trash. Yep.
Actually, I had a question about LNG. With the court order stay being put on the export ban, and now we're allowed to export to non-free trade countries LNG again, do you see that helping prices in the domestic industry grow more, or possibly increase our power bills now that there's more demand for domestically produced LNG?
Yeah. It's a great question. So LNG, it's really tricky because we did have, there were a lot of, if you look at the IEA joint communique from in 2021, 2022, really during the war in Ukraine, everybody in Europe wanted our natural gas. They actually still do want our natural gas. They just don't want to say it. And it hasn't hurt them on a CO2 emissions perspective, but they desperately need that natural gas. And so everybody wants it. Asia wants it. Our allies want it. They may not want to publicly say out loud that they want it, but they do want it. And the problem with that permit ban or the export permit ban, the global LNG amount of that 400 BCF a day, it's about 55 billion cubic feet per day. I know that the 2022 number was 52, so I'm guessing 2023 is probably about 55 BCF a day. So by all accounts, it's a pretty new nascent market, right? You have to develop it. And if if you think about oil and gas and refineries or midstream, you have to have a lot of redundancy in the system. Like you have to have more extra pipeline capacity for an oil field to get developed. And then it's not great for the midstream guys that's moving it. But if that doesn't happen, the oil and gas doesn't get produced because when you near that pipeline capacity, you have differentials blow out and you have pricing issue. The same thing goes for LNG. We're producing this natural gas here. We have 125 billion cubic feet per day. We're only exporting about 14 to 15 BCF a day. And so if we could export another 5 BCF a day, that would be great for our market, but it would be really, really good for the global market because it would lower the spot prices for global LNG. And it directly impacts the ability for countries, it strangleholds countries like Russia who are still exporting it. And it really, really helps Asian countries. It sort of just helps energy security overall. But that ban on the permits, what it does is it just sends a signal to investors that they have to get nervous. And the immediate signal was sent to Asia that they may not be able to buy in 2030 or 2035 or 2040, we may not be exporting natural gas. That's exactly what it did. And actually, all those Asian countries immediately doubled down on coal. They're looking at coal and they're looking at nuclear. So if it was about CO2 emissions, we damned ourselves there. It didn't help. So it's not, it really hurt the ability for these countries to think about what they're building their whole country off this. They're building their manufacturing capacity. They're retooling from coal to natural gas. So when we do something like that and we do it as a political move here and everybody says, oh, it's no big deal, it was just political. Well, it has had huge cascading consequences. And you saw as a response, a lot of long-term LNG contracts get signed up for between Europe and the Middle East and between Europe and Northern Africa and between Asia and the Middle East and North Africa as well and Australia. So it basically just moved things around. It didn't change anything. And that's, I think, the biggest takeaway here is that you can want all these things and you can believe in it, but it hasn't changed. You're just moving it around the map. And that's what's really happening. And when you're moving it around the map, the countries that have human rights standards, have emission standards, have the ability to actually do this, you're relegating it to places that don't. And there's consequences that are huge. And wars increase CO2 emissions, they don't lower them. And I could care less about the CO2 emission in war, I care about the people. But we see a direct correlation with that, and we're increasing wars, we're not decreasing them. But to answer your question, I mean, it's unless we start exporting another few BCF a day incremental export, or we allow more natural gas into the electricity pool. In Colorado, Excel is capped at 20%. So if Excel would allow more, natural gas to get into the grid, it would help on prices, but it would also help your bills. It would just help power generation. And so there's a lot of that's happening. So that's the difference. I mean, some of the tailwinds that you could have from a Trump versus Harris is that you could have potentially more natural gas in the grid overall, which would be beneficial to prices. And if we exported a little bit more, you could probably get, if everybody could get like $4 a BCF, or an MCF, that would be great. And you could have a stabilization. The problem is when it goes up and it goes down, and you have that volatility. So I think it's possible. I'm not concerned about natural gas prices skyrocketing in the US for a sustained period of time just because we have so much of it. But you really do need that infrastructure. You need more pipelines, more exports, and you need to allow more natural gas into the grid. And the fact that we're not allowing it and all the AI companies are just direct lining into pipe, they're still using it. And so again, that goes to the CO2 emission, that the demand is there. You can't make these things without natural gas or coal right now. Yep.
First of all, the administrative ban is on, or moratorium is on federal lands. It's more of a conservation and sustainability of natural resources. But with that said, how do I take my engineering degree and get into a place where I can help put forward or domestic policy?
From a degree. So one, I think petroleum engineering you can do a lot with. I think it's an amazing degree. So if you don't want to put the drill bit in the ground and you don't want to actually drill and complete wells, there's a lot that you can do. And we need more people that actually understand the industry and understand what's going on to actually talk about it in Washington. So there's an onslaught from teaching to think tanks to I'd say working for a company and doing it is probably a good idea. So you know it and you probably already have some background in it, but knowing it and doing it and then being able to talk about it, because you can talk to any industry in the world, doesn't matter, separate from oil and gas, whether it's tech, whether it's wine, everybody talks about the regulations that they have, right? The impositions that they have, that people don't understand their business. And, the wine industry talks about, the sulfites don't give you a hangover, and it's the alcohol. And, we need sulfites to ship it across the water. It's the same with the oil industry talks about stuff. The tech industry talks about things that people don't understand. So there's a huge benefit to being in the industry, to being an engineer, to being knowledgeable, to have that credibility, and to be able to talk to people. So whether it's working for Wood Mackenzie or IHS or, any number or a company like mine and actually doing it, but knowledge is this stuff. It seems really simple when it's distilled and simplified, but it's not well understood even by folks within the oil and gas industry. But really, I spend a lot of time with folks outside of the oil and gas industry understanding how energy impacts what they do. And they don't have to agree with me, but we can at least have a conversation about price and where it's going, about the geopolitics and where the economy is going, and it can help them understand their businesses and how to plan for it. Yeah?
Since this energy revolution is sponsored by the government rather than innovation and driving technology, how does this affect what is best for the American people, me, the American government, and the people at the top, and the global economy and climate situation?
Well, I think so far it hasn't impacted the climate situation. If I'm not going to debate, the temperature rises or where we're going, because don't think you probably hit 3, and if you were, you might have already, you're going to hit it. But if you're 40,000 gigatons is just going to continue to rise, and yet we're decreasing, you're not impacting it. So having policies in the U.S. that are kind of pushed, one of the biggest things you see in oil and gas is the carbon sequestration credit, which a lot of people are talking about and doing, and they're leaning into because they're getting paid to, sequester this carbon. So if you get paid to do something, that's where money goes. Or that's where it's going to go. So you can do that. And that's where government says, hey, if we incentivize this, we do it. Well, I can also curb methane emissions and keep oil production up and focus on energy security if I give a tax credit to an oil and gas mom and pop company with older wells to capture that methane. So what you're seeing is that when you talk to a lot of industry leaders, a lot of executives in the space, they will honestly tell you, maybe not on camera, but they'll honestly tell you that this is really hurt innovation. Because if your government is picking your energy in your mix, and if Secretary Granholm, our energy secretary, is telling you, it's wind, solar, and the way she talks about hydrogen, it's going to be here tomorrow. Hydrogen, talk to your school of mines peers. It's 50 to 100 years out. So if you're banking your economy on it, you're going to have a problem. So it's stuff like that where there's a disconnect. And I think there's just a reality of geothermal is great, but it's probably not. It's not, I can't dispatch it and we can go with it tomorrow. So I think you just get a lot of inefficiencies, and the fact that we have seen a 4-cent increase, we've seen a near 30% increase in electricity prices in 4 years. There's actually an uptick. Apparently it's when you hit about 30% of renewables in your grid that it just rises exponentially. We've barely begun this. And so when your government's picking winners and losers, and all you have is wind and solar, that's all that it is. And everybody says it's cheap because they buy it cheap from China, but then they put it in their grid and it gets really expensive. So that's the problem, is you just get bad power generation, unreliable. And in Colorado, you have less reliable power and you have less affordable power. And so you increase that and it just gets much worse. So that's what you end up with. And I think the consequences, if you were to continue to go down this, you have the problems in Europe where they just accept the economic decline. And I hope that the American people are a little bit different and don't accept a fate of just, taking it and eating it. I think that, we're a bigger country, and I think it's going to be much harder for that. But a lot of people don't know that. A lot of people don't know that what the cost of wind, how much wind and solar is in the grid, the direct correlation with energy prices, because it's kind of in the beginning right now. Yeah?
Oh, I would say just to touch on that. You said that EU's kind of accepted it, but I would think that part of that has to do with the European Union, and we've seen some of the countries try to secede, but they really don't have the ability to now that they have this overarching bureaucracy. that limits them from leaving and implementing certain energy policies?
Well, they've all drank it. They've all drank the Kool-Aid, right? So, the Tories the Tories were as aggressive on green as the Labour Party in the UK. And they had the opportunity. I mean, no, the thing is that people need to speak out more like this, because we have one big thing I would say that is very, very clear in the stock market, where we trade like stocks. Because we have no one talking about energy and talking about, honestly, you have a lot of talk about wind and solar. It's actually not there. So one, it's not making money. The stocks aren't making money. But you would think if you just picked up the Wall Street Journal, the Financial Times, or listen to the stock market, that it is. And so you have a problem right now with the stock market actually evaluating oil and gas assets, whether it's a company and their stock, or because they can't properly evaluate where their assets are for the long term. If the IEA comes out 2 days ago and says, we're gonna curb oil demand by 2050 down to, half of consumption, and oil prices are gonna be $35 a barrel, the market's like, okay, well, this has to be short term. Well, that's ridiculous. That's not gonna happen. You can want that to happen, but we're not gonna go from 100 million barrels a day to 75 million barrels a day in 5 years. It's literally not gonna happen. So that has to be, you have to have people, politicians, and industry leaders and leaders just standing and explaining that, people on the stock market and people talking about this and saying, this is just the reality of the market. This is what's happening right now, and here's how you assess it and evaluate it. You may not like that you have all this 100 million barrels a day of oil and gas, or 100 million barrels a day oil demand, but you have it. You have it in a good economy, you have it in a bad economy, like we're there. It's just the reality. It's very, very hard to get rid of that. And that's that consumption, that driving. And that goes to your other CO2 emissions is, if you want to stop driving, you can really get rid of it, but then you really stop your economy. So you'd have to have somebody, a politician, be honest about that. And you do in other states. I was just in Wyoming, and I met the governor of Wyoming, and I talked to a bunch of out-of-state legislators, and I was talking about a little bit snippet of this. And it's very different than you see in Colorado. And in Colorado, there's not a lot of rational conversations like this going on, but in other states there is. I mean, in other states, they're not having the problems we have with electricity that we're having in Colorado with these rate increases, because they've accepted that we will have coal and natural gas in our grid, because frankly, a lot of these politicians want to get reelected because they know that their consumers need affordable energy and need to be able to turn the lights on. And the other thing I would say is that in Europe, what they did during the war in Ukraine, and what they still have, is like, you've decommissioned some nuclear in France because they really want to do that, but they doubled down on coal. Absolutely beyond double down on coal in Europe for a short time. And they were burning diesel instead of natural gas. So you can exacerbate the problems that you're trying to solve when you don't plan for the future and you don't have those fuels ready and available. And that's what we're actually seeing in Europe. We have not seen a bad winter. And when we do, it's not going to be very pretty. And you're gonna see them get cold, because those politicians will care about one thing, and their people is keeping the lights on and keeping power. Yeah?
As China's demand of oil decreases as they move more towards coal, do you see other developing nations picking up that demand and rising prices? Or do you think that where we're at now, where the floor is set by war, the ceiling is set by reduced demand, do you see that changing as other nations' economies grow over time, like India, for example?
India is growing. It's not growing to, it's a fraction of Chinese oil demand, and it will, as their economy grows overall, and they have a lot of work to get through. It's a growing economy, but there's a lot of messiness there. Just being honest about it. So it's a fraction of the oil demand of China, and China does believe in stockpiling. So probably 2 million barrels a day of that 17 million barrels a day demand has probably been stockpiling the last couple of years. So right now, I'm pretty pessimistic about the global economic outlook for growth. And usually it's growth in oil demand that drives oil prices up, and all this geopolitics. Like, we will definitely see, we have the risks for price spikes and the risks for production to come offline, especially in Iran and other places, and real geopolitical risk. And we still have, obviously, with Russia. So there's that. But in the next 5 years, there's not a demand growth story. And if you look back actually to 2008 and the financial crisis, we lost, and it's really important to appreciate this, we lost about 3 million barrels a day global demand, a little over 2 million barrels a day demand and change. The US was the leader in that demand drop. We curbed demand by about 2 million barrels a day, and it took us nearly a decade to recover that oil demand coming out of 2008, because we were still driving, we were still doing things, but it was a pullback, a real pullback. And so you see that in both the correlation to price when prices rise, but a pullback in these countries with recession. So the thing that lower oil prices can help that, can sustain momentum. So if we had a declining economy, which we already have, and we have oil prices, we're keeping demand up. We're already seeing that. But if we were to have a recession and high oil prices, it's going to be worse. And if we were to have a recession and low oil prices, and something that you actually saw like it or lump it during the Trump administration, he was so pro-oil that we had 50-ish oil, $50, $55 oil prices. And I would argue you had a regulatory system that would allow you to build more things and have the infrastructure and capture your gas, et cetera. But you had lower prices. And so you have to, like, global economy right now, it's not China. India will take it, but they won't offset that. Europe certainly not. For the CO2 emissions, as well as just the economy backsliding, more so for the economy backsliding. And then the US, we're at 20 million barrels a day, and we just really haven't upticked. So you could see some shift in the US economy if we were to go in recession or come out, or really change up the economy and say this is an economic growth story. You could see demand pick up in the US. But I don't think we're not talking a couple million barrels a day. It's got to be incremental. And we just have it's so much supply. We have so much supply in the US, we have so much supply in Canada. And so when you have $70, $80 oil, and this is the lesson that OPEC Saudi is learning hard, is that high oil prices for several years equals high production. Yeah?
I mean, certainly there is a price for oil so that oil companies can continue to grow and innovate. Else, if it goes below that, then it might threaten our own domestic supply.
Yeah, but what we see is that if you study demand forecasts, so supply and demand, OPEC, EIA, Energy Information Administration, and IEA, I've done all of them. If you go back in time and you look back from 80s to now, there's two big things they all got wrong. When they projected that high oil prices would be lower demand, and they projected that high oil prices would be they projected very low very low production. So regardless of the price, they didn't see consumption going up nearly enough. And they had a correlation between higher production and higher prices and lower consumption. And the opposite happened. We actually had much higher oil price, or much lower oil prices, and much higher output and production. And we had, much more steadier consumption regardless of that price. And so you see countries like Japan, the U.S. and Germany, industrialized, developed countries, we respond to oil prices. Our economy does well when prices go to 60, depending on a lot of different factors of economics. Whereas China and India, their demand is just one direction. So yes, but I would say be careful with that, because if I was, I wish that the oil and gas industry, if I had an oil company during COVID, I would have drilled and completed wells at the cheapest possible price. And we didn't see that, and we should have. But we did see some companies actually do that. They drilled, and the moment prices started moving up, and we were at $50 oil, and all the best experts in the world were saying, U.S. shale will not come back until it's $70 oil. And that was absolutely not true. So yes, there's a floor. Exactly where is it, and how long is it going to be there? It's more like, when will you shut in production? And I don't think we don't have an economy. You can't stay at 40. You can go to 50, but you'd have to have a really tough economy. But yeah, you have a floor, but there's a lot of factors with it. And I think our industry is we're less interested in shutting in oil. We'll ride through the pain a little bit and then respond.
Certainly is in OPEC's interest to drive it below the floor.
Yeah, but they can't take that pain very long. So that's what I'm saying, is that the U.S. shale is more resilient. And I think it's much more resilient than OPEC realizes, than Saudi. They know that now, and I don't think they're trying to drive that floor. They could try to kill it. They've done that twice. It didn't work. That's what you try to hurt this industry, and it's pretty resilient. It comes back. In fact, it comes back a little stronger. So they could hurt other production for sure, but they've been at 9 million barrels a day. They're now at $70 oil. So they could flood the market, but then what if they don't get that back? What if we go into recession? At the same time, they don't want $100 oil, because that will put the economy in recession. So they're in an okay spot where they're saying we'll take a fiscal hit for the medium term. But if they're thinking about this, they're probably going to have to increase production. But yes, they could, in theory, they could take a gamble and do it. They did it in 2020, and it didn't work. So I would say that would be a very big gamble if you're trying to kill U.S. shale. And I think U.S. shale is much, much more resilient than it was pre-COVID. So it's going to be very difficult. The balance sheets are shored up. A lot of folks, it's not good. You're going to see activity decline, but they're not going to go away. and they're going to use that opportunity to bulk up. I mean, if oil prices go down, I'm buying wells, and and then you just come back, and that's what people do in this industry typically. All right. Well, thank you guys.